Hi, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden, and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as we see it in organizations and communities, can benefit other humans and the planet we all depend upon. We're speaking to people who are in the middle of doing it, people who think they know how to do it, and people who are doing in-depth academic studies of what really works and probably what doesn't as well. We love theory, but mainly we're interested in practice and lived experience, what it's like to actually experience toxic or even healthy power. So with all of that said, let's get into a little bit into that conversation with our current guest, who is Daniel Thornton. Daniel and I, we've known each other for quite a while. Welcome, Daniel.
Great to be here.
Lovely, thank you. I wanted to say we're interviewing all kinds of people, and to some extent we're trying to steer away from the kind of great and the good. But Daniel's someone who has worked with the great and the good, as I'll let him explain in a minute. Um, Currently, you're at the WHO, I believe, but you've also worked in health, in education, and in the civil service for a considerable amount of time. So, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your current role, perhaps, and also how you got here? That would be lovely to hear.
Great. Thanks very much, Pete. So I work for the World Health Organization, as you said, which is based in the headquarters is in Geneva, but it's a global organization with 194 member states and 154 country offices, so pretty much everywhere. And my job is to raise money for WHO, and this year we're trying to raise $7 billion for the next 4 years, and that's to allow WHO to perform its role of kind of setting standards for health, helping governments implement those standards all around the world, and responding to emergencies as well, when there are disease outbreaks or humanitarian emergencies. They always have a health component, so WHO is there to minimize the kind of losses of life and the disease that comes along with humanitarian emergencies. So I'm pretty new in this role. I've only been with WHO for 4 months. Before that, as you were saying, I worked in another health organization called Gavi, which funds immunization in lower income countries. And then before that, mainly in the civil service, with a bit of an interlude in a think tank. So I've certainly thought a bit about power and how it operates in different organizations. And as somebody who's been interested in politics since I was young, kind of certainly thought a bit about power, and how it's deployed for a few years.
Lovely, thank you. I'd love to touch on that a little bit. I mean, your early experiences, and you said you were interested in politics from an early age. How did that come about? What made you interested in politics?
I don't know, actually. I don't know where that came from. I mean, I think other kids were interested in sport, and I was interested in politics. So,
Uh-huh.
I'd kind of get interested in elections, and and kind of it was the way that kids kind of collect things, and I'd be a bit obsessive about understanding the electoral system of the Netherlands or something, and what was going on in countries around the world. So it was a sort of it was a kind of bit of a some people collect rocks. I collected electoral systems, that sort of thing.
You
So
had
it's a
all
bit of a
the cards that came with it, yeah, like Prime Minister
exactly,
cards or whatever.
exactly. Bit of a geek, I'm afraid.
That's fine. No, that's fine. And what was your? I mean, did you have any kind of personal experiences of power at that early age then, or you were
Well, I
just
think we
thinking? You were thinking about it.
I think we experience it all the time, all around
Mm,
us, every moment of our lives. I think
mm,
everything there's a kind of network of relationships that inevitably have um, power dynamics as one of the features of those networks. So I think it's ever present. I think the thing when you're interested in politics is you're kind of explicitly looking at power and how people exercise power and gain power, and but at a significant scale, of course. And I think it was probably later in life that I got interested in how organizations work,
Okay.
and on a sort of slightly smaller scale, particularly when I was asked to kind of help introduce some changes across Gavi, and as part of that, read some theory, read some got interested in kind of how do you successfully bring people with you as you try and make changes, and benefit from their expertise, and so on. So I think that was a moment when I started to think more about how organizations work.
Because as you're saying, when you're in the civil service and you're working closely with politicians and so forth, it's all on a very big scale, isn't it? You're thinking about the country or something like that. Whereas what you're talking about at Gavi is the local experience of power, working with a group of people. And how do you, as you say, you experience that all day long, don't you? The kind of push and pull of power, but trying to work with that. Could you say a little then about what you discovered as you got into that more local version of it?
Well, I was just going to come back to your point about the politics being about operating at scale, and that's right, of course. You're kind of looking at national policy or international policy or whatever it might be. But at the same time, what happens in politics is often very determined by very local relationships and the kind of character and capacities of individuals. And in a way, we saw that very clearly the other night in the US presidential election debate. What individuals can bring to their roles is obviously key, and that applies to politicians as much as anybody else, and the relationships between different politicians. I think that things operate on those different levels all the time. There's a kind of there's a larger scale kind of environment which you might be operating on, or which certainly operates on whatever you're doing. But there's also the very local and all the relationships that you have around you. I mean, explicit. So, focusing a bit more on the Gavi example, a new CEO came into Gavi, and like many incoming CEOs, they like some things about the organization and other things less. But I guess when you join an organization, you don't know much about it. You're not sure how to get things done. Anyway, so he asked me to kind of set up a group of people across the organization. So we drew on people from all the different teams, and brought them together in a kind of was called a lab, because it was deliberately experimental, and we got people out of their day jobs and into this process offsite, so giving people time to kind of think about things without worrying about the day job so much, and having a kind of focus on the mission and what we were trying to achieve, which was immunizing children mainly in lower income countries, and looking at the barriers to doing that effectively, but giving people people had a pretty free rein in terms of what the solutions, what we might be doing better, and how we might make the changes. And so I guess that was the first time I'd done a sort of an explicit effort to introduce changes, really thinking about the way the organization worked, and the kind of the normal obstacles that you get to making change. I think often what you get is a sort of, here's a set of new policies, everybody kind of get on with this, and actually, the policies may or may not change anything. They may or may not achieve what was intended. They may or may not. You often get a kind of pretending that people are following policies. So how do you get people developing their own ideas about how things can be done better, and then them themselves implementing those changes, rather than it being a kind of consultancy coming in, coming up with some bright ideas and then leaving. So that was an interesting process for me.
What did you? Thank you. So it sounds like a great example. And what did you were talking about bringing this group together, who from different parts of the organization, and presumably there were different kind of. Everyone will have had their own experiences with power and their own kind of power relations with those around them. So was there anything kind of explicit you did around that? Did you talk to them about power, or did it just how did you work with it, I suppose?
Yeah, it was very much a learning exercise for me, and it was facilitated. The process was facilitated by two people. One called Richard Pascal, who sadly has just died, but was really a really interesting and impressive guy. He wrote several books about how to kind of work in organizations. He was interested in complexity. And his colleague Martin Herman, who is still very much alive and is working on planetary health, which is an interesting subject. And the two of them really sort of, I learned a lot from working with them, particularly with Martin, on how to talk about power explicitly and how to have people kind of think about. I mean, they didn't call it healthy power, but it was sort of power between people, and what you can kind of create if you give people space to bring their own ideas and speak freely, which sometimes in organizations is difficult.
Nearly always in organizations is difficult, perhaps. Yeah.
Exactly. And we aim to create a space in this in these labs where people could speak freely, but the hierarchy kept intruding. People would say, oh well, this is all very well, but X person isn't going to accept this, so why are we bothering? Or how do we report back on all this stuff, because it's going to be really, people aren't going to like it, how are we going to kind of communicate all this stuff? So as you say, you never get away from hierarchy, but I think you can. It's sometimes pretty helpful to try and operate a little bit outside hierarchy, or to kind of minimize hierarchy, accepting that as you try and implement things, inevitably that's going to be done through and with the hierarchy. So you have to kind of operate with the hierarchy in the end as well. I mean, it helped that we had the CEO kind of saying that this was important and he wanted this to happen, and he was, so people kind of who might have otherwise resisted some of the changes were more inclined to take it seriously.
Well, it's true. It's true, isn't it? I mean, you talked about Joe Biden, and there is a difference between kind of people who are kind of top leaders like Joe Biden or something, in the sense that people pay more attention to the words that they speak. Of course, he and the other people around him, and I know you've also worked with, I think you worked with the Prime Minister in the UK, didn't you? And I'm imagining that even then there's a local conversation that goes on. It's still like you're just talking with a bunch of people. That's what you're doing. And people pay more attention to those people, the CEO. So you can't, you're saying, I think that the hierarchy is going to be there. And even if you create a different kind of space, a local space like the one you were creating with Richard and Martin, is it where a different conversation can happen? You've got to take the hierarchy into account. Is that right?
Definitely, yeah. And I think it's also really important how the top person or top team kind of operate, in terms of, are they people who listen to advice? Are they people who are interested in the evidence, regardless of who's providing it, or are they only going to listen to messages that come from the hierarchy and from and I think that's one of the things for me about the sort of healthiness or not of power is are you interested in evidence? Are you interested in, and of course there's never in most areas of life, there's not a kind of 100% certainty about what the evidence tells you. But certainly you can be guided by the evidence more or less. And I think, if you want to have an impact anywhere, you've got to have a truthful conversation and gather whatever evidence you can about what's really going on and what's making things happen, and who the key people are, and how to get stuff done in whatever the environment is. So part of what you need if you're trying to make some changes is that truthful conversation, and the creating the conditions in which people can have those truthful conversations, because as you were saying earlier, hierarchy intrudes, and people don't want to say things that are going to upset powerful people. And if you make changes, it often does upset powerful people.
Lovely. This is great. Thank you. This is so good. But I want to drop down a level or so in both areas if we can. So I'd love to hear more about, because I hadn't really kind of twigged, WHO and healthy power. I hadn't thought about health words. So I'd like to understand more about what you think healthy power is. But I was also curious about Richard and Martin. And did you learn, was there anything you learned specifically in terms of the practices? Because I know people, facilitators, I do it, and can stand up and say, oh, we've got to sort of think about power. But what were they, was there something clear that they were doing that you learned? Or anything you learned from them really about how to do this?
Well, I think there were sort of technical aspects of how do you facilitate a workshop? How do you kind of keep things kind of moving on relevant issues? How do you recognize people sufficiently? Both of them came with quite a lot of theory as well, and as I said, there's sort of interest in complexity, interest in Richard Pascal particularly wrote a book about positive deviance, which probably in branding terms needs another name, but is an interesting theory. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but yes. But the idea that rather than designing a solution kind of globally or at the top of the hierarchy or whatever, and then implementing it, you go and look for what's working already around whatever system you're looking at, and try and learn from that, and then have those wherever it's working kind of be the advocates for change. And I think that's part of that, and I think part of what I reflected on working with Richard and Martin was a certain humility about what and what it's possible to know from the center of an organization, from the top of an organization, and that the sort of expertise, there's a degree to which every person is an expert in their own perspective. There's a degree to which every person is an expert in their own environment, and that needs to be that you should try and benefit from that. Whereas most of the time you don't, because people are just staying in they've been told to stay in their lane, so they keep their head down, and they don't talk about what they see and what solutions they could see could work given the way they see things. So I think that was interesting as well, and how we kind of learned from that. And because Gavi worked with 55 lower income countries around the world, and we were particularly interested in how vaccines were delivered from the kind of capital or port or wherever they arrived, airport, to clinics, and what happened in between, and kind of, so you could have said, and certainly there was a tendency to say, okay, we're going to do a big analysis and say, okay, this is how many links there are in the supply chain, and this is the digital system that these people need, and kind of say globally, okay, well, we're going to try and fix this problem, but actually a lot of the constraints weren't technical. They were about power in supply chains, and who a given level of government had what power over what, and it was very powerful as we did to talk to people who were managing successfully in very constrained environments, and learn from that, and have them kind of explain what they were doing to others in other countries or other parts of where you had a big country, other regions of that country or whatever. And how you kind of communicate on stock levels and all these kind of things. In other words, the human aspects of it were often the main constraints. It wasn't about, oh, actually, we haven't got the right IT, or we haven't got the right lorries or whatever it is. Those certainly were issues, but they weren't often the main issue. And it was often important to learn from that very human kind of perspective. So that was an interesting part of the process, and I think it applies generally. I mean, coming back to your sort of point about healthy power and WHO, I mean, indeed, I mean, health is a kind of general objective that people have. Everybody wants to be healthy, and in a way, you can kind of, to some extent, not always, but you can bring people together by focusing on, okay, how do we help people be more healthy? That's something that, relatively speaking, in the international system, you can reach agreement on. Of course, there are big disagreements about many issues, but relative to other issues, it's something you can say, okay, well, everybody wants to be healthy, everybody wants their population to be healthy. And in that, I think one of WHO's key roles is to say, well, this is the best evidence that we can find on this subject of what the right sort of treatment is, what the right way of preventing disease is, and working with that. So that's something I really appreciate about working at the WHO.
The seeking evidence and looking for an evidential base for things. And the other thing I heard was, when you were talking earlier about that, about Gabby, you were talking about the kind of openness of the CEO, or the kind of sense of inquiry and listening and trying to find out and taking advantage of the different voices. I mean, I also want to say that I mean, all of this is quite difficult to talk about, isn't it? And I'm kind of asking you to kind of give examples, but I know that there's a tendency, isn't there, to kind of generalize around it all, when, as you said, when you're talking about a supply chain and different people in that supply chain, every single one of those relationships is going to be different, and they're having very particular kind of experiences. So I know I'm asking, so I guess there's this tendency to shift to kind of like, how could we do it on aggregate? And then again, you said there's all these different countries with different, and then millions of different people that we're talking about, isn't it? So I don't know, how do we, and I suppose that's the core of my question. If I go back to Martin and Richard and something that they're doing, is it in the manner, the way they're being open? As you said, they brought in some theory, which probably goes down well in certain places and not so much in others. And I'm also just really interested in how you personally, what you do now in terms of dealing with power, when you notice it with your boss or wherever.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of them were very open and approachable, and not not kind of standing on ceremony, and I think curiosity is important. You've got to be sort of willing to just kind of try and understand what's going on, and talk to people in a way that allows them to open up.
And is this what your practice you've brought to your own work now, then, would you say, or you always had it, or has it changed? Or,
well, I guess I've tried to. I guess I've tried to. Yes, always. I think being playful is one thing that helps. It's not being too serious. I find is an important antidote to some of the sort of constraints of organizations. I mean, obviously, there are situations when that's not. You got to take it easy with the humor, but I think I do find that helps. as well as making daily life more bearable.
Yes, yes. Well,
um,
particularly in the areas you're working with very serious topics, aren't you?
yeah,
WHO,
yeah,
UK government, etc., etc. They're very serious things. But you're saying you
yeah.
would try and inject, personally, you'll try and inject some humour and playfulness into it all.
Absolutely, absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. And I think that's definitely something if you're working with a very powerful person, the sort of, the kind of Shakespeare thing about never a truer word in jest and all that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
You can sometimes get across difficult messages by not being too serious, and that can be helpful. I guess the other thing I was thinking about, as you were saying about the sort of scale and how do you operate at that scale? I think so. I mean, to take the example of WHO, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's 154 country offices and 194 member states, and so they all kind of you have ideally you bring the evidence on a subject that say, oh, smoking's really bad for you, no surprise there, but maybe also vaping's really bad for you. That's which maybe people are less aware of, or at least the evidence is kind of starting to emerge that it's not good for you.
Mm.
Um, and uh, you have a kind of global discussion. You have let's see what we can agree among the 194 member states. But then, and that it should be driven by whatever the scientific evidence is. But then the question of, okay, well, what happens in each country is, you can't just kind of publish something and say, okay, well, there we go, off you go, folks. The 154 country offices play a really important role in saying locally to the governments, okay, well, what's the implication of this here?
Mm.
Is this a priority for you, given everything else that's going on? Do you want to look at taxing tobacco more? Do you want to, think about regulating vapes or whatever it is, so kids don't start smoking vapes at a young age? And have that sort of local conversation.
Mm.
And I think that's really important
Mm.
in seeing how science gets applied. It's not an abstract thing. It doesn't just sit in a library in Geneva. It's something that gets built into national legislation or
Mm.
policies or taxes or whatever it might be. Um, uh, and that I think is one way that the system can work. I mean, it's also tricky because obviously, 154 country offices. Uh, it's not very centralized.
Mm.
Different things are going to happen in different places, and the
Mm.
messiness of that is
Mm.
maybe
Mm.
difficult to manage in some ways.
For sure.
Yeah.
I remember years ago talking to somebody who was researching media use as well, and they'd been studying Dallas, the TV show, in all kind of different countries around the world. And what was most striking was how the people watching it had completely different understandings of it, depending on which country they lived in. Some would imagine it maybe the way we might, which was, kind of a family saga and the powerful doing this or whatever. And other people in other countries saw it in a completely different way, which came from their own kind of cultures they were living in. So I'm guessing that it's also how these messages are going to land, isn't it, in different countries? People are going to interpret them differently. What is going to be heard is
Yeah, I
different.
mean, to take the example of tobacco, some countries grow a lot of tobacco,
Yeah.
and
So
so how does that play? In
yeah.
say, oh, okay, well, you think you should put up taxes on tobacco. Well, it's a slightly different matter if they've got a lot of farmers who are depending on
And if you're
growing tobacco.
a farmer and you believe, that's how you get your living. So you see it as a good thing. So it's
Yeah,
hard to
yeah,
kind of change those
yeah,
views, isn't it? Lovely.
yeah.
Um, I mean, of course, I'm also curious about when you have worked with senior people, like I mentioned, the Prime Minister. So, I mean, it's kind of it's just a bit naughty just to kind of be curious about it. And I'm not asking you to kind of give away any kind of secrets, but I'm interested in the difference, I suppose, between how some of us think about power. I imagine in a prime minister's office, it's like, oh, there's a different level, or is it actually the same as what you're talking about? Small group of people sitting around talking about stuff, making jokes occasionally. Is there a difference? How does it work?
Well, I think that is an important feature of it all, and that whether that's an informal meeting. So I worked for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister. I was what was called a private secretary. So and so some of it would happen in informal discussions, but there are also more formal settings. So the cabinet meeting, or kind of Parliament, obviously, and each of these different formal settings has their own rules, and you've got to record what's said. You've got to, this kind of rules about who speaks when, those sort of things. So I think there are maybe some. I mean, I guess that's true in any organisation. There are settings which are informal and formal, but you need to know about those different rules and the different kind of context for those things as well. And for example, all the relationship between Number 10 and the Treasury is a kind of vital relationship at the centre of government. And I guess you get that in any large organisation. You get different centres of power. And how they interact is one of the key things about how effective the organization is. Does the organization spend time kind of just fighting between the different power centers internally, or are they sufficiently united to say, okay, we might have our disagreements, but we do agree about this key thing and we're going to work on it together? And that's so how do you bring that about is a really important issue in the effectiveness of organizations.
Again, it's not something you can ignore. It's part of that pattern. So there's a hierarchical pattern often, and you're talking about a pattern of power between departments or something like that. So you can't ignore it. But there's also you mentioned formality and informality. So again, this is my experience, I guess, that people say one thing in a formal setting and then they go off outside and say, "Oh, that was a waste of time," or whatever. You had those kind of experiences too. And again, how do you work with it, I guess?
Well, that's right, and anything that's going to be publicly recorded is going to have a very different character than anything that's in private, which is difficult because then people say, "Oh, well, you're not being transparent because you're doing everything in private." But if you want to have a real conversation, it's got to be in private. So, I think, but ultimately, probably to make formal decisions and to make sort of binding decisions, they have to become public, and they have to, because people will want to hold whoever's making those decisions accountable. So you can cook things up in private, but then you've got to kind of bring it to a public forum in a way in any organization to implement it. It's got to appear in the annual accounts of a business, or it's got to appear in the record of Parliament, or in the cabinet minutes, or in legislation, whatever it might be. It's got to be formally implemented. So that's one tension. I mean, the other thing that that's important, I think, in my world, and I think probably many people working in development, which I guess is applies to some of the other speakers who've been on this podcast, is the question of, and it's one of the constraints that you've got to work with, I think, in thinking about how to use power healthily, is that if somebody gives you some money, they're going to want to understand what's happened to it. And there's a flow of resources in any organization or into the organization from elsewhere that comes with an obligation of accountability. And I think that often has some perverse effects, because people, in a way, it's a version of hierarchy, that somebody's got power, they give it in the form of money, and they give you some money, and then you've got to report back to them. And one of the things for WHO at the moment is it gets much of its money in very small pots from different donors, and that means we write 3,000 reports a year to those various donors explaining what's been done with the money, and it's very high transaction cost, and it's one of the things we're trying to move away from. So I think when donors are, or whoever's philanthropists, whatever they might be, they provide money, but the way that the accountability works can often have perverse effects. It can often lead to people wasting a lot of time reporting, but also focusing on the things that they're paying for to the exclusion of other things, whereas those other things might be really important to the overall functioning of the system. So that's a tricky dynamic, I think, in trying to use power healthily. But it's one of those
Mm,
constraints you need to work with, I think.
mm, mm. Lovely.
Um,
We're heading towards the time we need to kind of wind up, but I just want to give you a bit more of an open space just to say anything else you think is important. And particularly, again, if you can, I mean, I don't mind theory, but particularly, again, if there are things that you have learned and now put in, of all these experiences you've had, and now put into practice in the places you're working, and obviously how you deal with healthy power at the big level, but also locally in your own organization, anything like that would be lovely to hear.
I suppose listening to the other episodes on this really interesting series, one of the things I was thinking about was you defined power, I think, as achieving goals, and I was thinking about how hard it is sometimes to know what the goals are,
Mhm.
and that goals are often people often have a whole range of different goals. Some of them they admit to, and some of them they're less prepared to admit to. But every individual needs to look after themselves to some extent. They need to earn a salary, or whatever, have some money to live on. They need to People need recognition, and people don't get recognition, they kind of shrivel, I think. And So in any situation, people are going to be worrying about those things, as well as the explicit goal of, oh, let's reduce poverty in this village, or bring safe drinking water to people, or whatever it might be. um, uh, and I think that's important to bear in mind. And the same applies at the organizational level, that organizations need to look after themselves to some extent. And that's sort of what I'm doing for WHO. You've got to have the money to pay people's salaries. You've got to have the money to run programs. Um, and if organizations don't look after themselves, they're useless, because they go out of business. But at the same time, the competition between organizations often, even where you're trying to pursue lofty goals like saving lives, encouraging healthy behavior, all that sort of thing, the competition between organizations sometimes relates to how organizations are looking after themselves. And sometimes some organizations look after themselves very aggressively. And that, so it's kind of how healthy is the balance between the different goals that an organization is pursuing, and how healthy is the balance between different goals that an individual is pursuing. But I'd also say the other key thing is that humility about not knowing exactly what the goals are, and being prepared to have them, to explore them and adapt as you go along, because you don't know at the beginning of a process what the circumstances are you're getting into, in a way, and you need to learn from the people who are already in it to kind of appreciate what it is you should be doing. You might start a process with one goal and then learn some more about it, and then actually think, we're trying to do something else here. So I think that all of that's very important as well, and that's something certainly I try and keep an open mind, particularly as I'm new in this rather large and complex organization, trying to learn about the different parts of it and see it from different perspectives at different country offices and regions and so on. Just to understand more about what could be achieved, and how to do it.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for bringing that in, the multiplicity of goals. I mean, sometimes when I talk about this, I use slightly different language, which is to talk about needs rather than goals. And of course, as you say, we have all kinds of different needs. We might have a need to be really successful in terms of our work, but we also have a need to kind of look after our families or whatever it is. And then, as you're also saying, just staying flexible with those, and curious and humble about them, even as they change, because needs kind of shift even in a conversation, don't they? At the beginning of a conversation, you might have one thing, and then somebody that need is met, and then you move on to something else. So it can happen really quickly, and shift, and staying open to that seems really important. Thank you so much. That's been really helpful, really interesting. Love to get you back in a year or so, if that's okay, and hear
Great.
how it's kind of moved on. What else can I say? Well, just thank you. It's just been brilliant, really fascinating. Really appreciate having you here.
Great to be here. Thanks so much, Pete. See you
Thanks.
soon.
Thanks a lot. And for everybody else, we will issue some other episodes in the not too distant future. So watch this space.